We're going to get started. This morning's class is Gary and Sally Haber. Gary Miz and Sally Haber. Leilui Nishmat Shafia Batzakia.
Hold on.
It says like this. You hear me or no? My internet seems to not be great today. I'm not sure why.
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. Okay. So today we're going to talk about a new topic, an eruv, but a different kind of eruv. It's called an eruv tehumin. Up until now, we've been talking about eruv chatzerot, which we talked about. We discussed. It's an eruv that surrounds a particular area that allows me to carry. Now we're going to talk about a different kind of eruv that allows me to do something else that I'm to do on Shabbat, and that is to travel in some way. So allow me to explain. So it says like this: Ne'emar b'Torah, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Re'u ki Hashem natan lachem haShabbat, Shvu ish tachtav al yatzei ish mekomo v'yom hashvi. Hashem says to Moshe, look, Hashem gave you, say to Bnei Israel, Hashem gave you the Shabbat, and therefore He's giving you on the sixth day bread for 2 days. We remember, the man was given for 2 days on Friday. Shvu ish tachtav. Everyone should sit, where he is. Al yetzei ish mekomo v'yom hashvi. No one should leave his place on the seventh day. They learn, sit in your place. This is don't not go the 4 amalot, which we talked about carrying. Al yetzei ish mekomo. No one should leave his place. This is 2,000 amah, the 2,000 amah that a person can't travel from where he is in any given direction. On Shabbat, we are limited and we are supposed to stay in the place that we started. That's the idea of Tehum Shabbat, which we're going to talk about now. So he says, from this pasuk that we just read, the Chachamim teach that you're forbidden to leave your city more than 2,000 amah on Shabbat. Now, we're going to have to define what does it mean, the city, and we also have to define what's the 2,000 amah. So an amah is about 1.5 feet. So 2,000 amah is about 3,000 feet. 3,000 feet is not a lot of space, right? 3,000 feet, if there's a reference, right, a mile is 50 to 80, right? 5,280. So this is less than a mile that we're not allowed to leave the city. So that's a very short distance. Many people walk a mile to shul, no problem, right? If you walk from our homes to the Coney Island boardwalk, right, that's 2 miles, right? So you're talking about a very, very short distance. The person is not allowed to travel. Now, I'm not saying you can't walk to the boardwalk because the boardwalk is within the city. It's within the Tehum, right? But once we were to be leaving the city, right, and however we define leaving the city, but once we define leaving the city, a person cannot go very far. A person has to actually stay really close to where they are. So in New York, it's kind of hard to exit the city because there's really no, it's hard, right? But in other places, especially, if you go away to, a resort or something like that, to leave the resort, very often, if you go to a place in, I don't know, Arizona or some places in the Caribbean or things like that, those places are very isolated on purpose. To leave the grounds of the hotel would be a violation of Tehum Shabbat. Now, where is the boundary? So he says, he says, wherever the last of the houses are in that town, then that's where you count. That's where you start counting 1,000 feet. So wherever people stop living, then that's where you stop, right? Which again, in New York City, come into. In a lot of other places, I'd argue most other places, are from where we are. That's the basic rule of Shabbat, right? There's a certain boundary or border to Shabbat that I'm allowed to travel. Wherever I start the Shabbat, that's where I'm supposed to stay, right? And this doesn't matter how I travel, right? This doesn't matter. I mean, anyway, you're not getting in a car, riding on an animal, or flying in a plane or something like that on Shabbat. So that is what it is. on a boat, it's interesting because the boat does move the Tehum and you do leave, but you generally stay on the boat. And this is one of the reasons you can't get off a boat on Shabbat, right? So sometimes if you're on a cruise or something like that and it docks on Shabbat, you can't leave, not only because of this, but partly because of this. He says, so let's say that tomorrow, I'm in my hometown, and tomorrow in the next town over, there's a wedding, pay respects to someone, someone invited me for a Shabbat meal. There's a reason to go to the next town, right? And the next town is, let's say, 4,000 feet away, right? We can only travel 3,000 feet, and that next town, there's a gap between my town, where my town ends, and where that town begins, of 4,000 feet, or something like that, or 5,000 feet, right? It's a mile apart, right? So he says, what could you do? He says, on Friday, you have to do this before Shabbat, he can, before it gets dark, he can set aside 2 meals. You have to put away 2 meals, and we're going to talk about what that means, and leave it somewhere in between the 2 towns. And by doing that, he establishes that that's his place, right? Wherever he sets the meal up, that's his place. And that's called an eruv techumin. So it's also an eruv, but a different kind of eruv than what we've been talking about. And once he sets that up, now that where he set that meal up is considered his resting place, where he is for Shabbat. And even if he goes back to his home and he sleeps there and so on, but he can use that as the anchor point for which he can travel. So is that clear? I mean, it's a basic rule. It's a little complicated, but and it doesn't happen to us that often. Yeah, I've actually never heard anybody do this because it's so limited in the circumstances that it'll apply. Because if the city, all this allows you to do is to travel an extra 2,000 amalot. The most you can move it, right? You have to set the meal up within 2,000 amalot from the end of the city, because otherwise you can't get to it. And then you can only travel an extra 2,000 amalot beyond that. So you can only travel 4,000 total, but less than that, which is 6,000 feet, right? Which is a mile and a little bit, right? A mile and a tenth, a mile and a quarter, less than a mile and a quarter, actually. So where are you going, right? Like this doesn't really come into play in too many practical cases that we would be in, but that's how it works. Okay. So he says, now he's allowed to do this even if he stays where he sets this meal up, right? Like a little box with food. He could set it up outside the city, 1,999 amot away, right? And then he sets it up there from Friday, and then he could go back, right? And he could go to sleep, in his bed, which is in the city, and then the next day when he has to walk, he can walk the 2,000 amot to the meal, and then he could walk another 2,000 amot from the meal, but then he's got to stop. So hopefully that second city that he's going to is within that place. And again, that's called the eruv techumin. I'm just trying to think what else. He has a lot here. I'm just trying to stick to the basics of what we would need to know. Okay. So he says, let me just see. I just explain. I basically just explained most of what he just said. Yeah. Right. Now, one of the things that also happens is when you set this eruv up, let's say I'm heading east, right, from the city, right? East, anyway, it doesn't matter. Let's say I'm heading east, okay? So I'm heading east, and I can now extend the amount of east that I could go by this extra 2,000 amma by putting the meal there. When I extend that, I can only travel in that direction. I've changed my center of place, right? So I now in the other direction, wherever the city stops, I can't go even 2 steps, right? Because where I really am is where I set that meal up, right? So I could continue to walk within the city, but I can't go north or south or west even a little bit, because wherever that little piece is, that's what sets me up, and I can't go further, right? So that's another aspect of Tehum Shabbat. Again, this ends up being more in theory and in learning than it does in practice. I can't think of too many situations where someone is actually going to use this. But it's not our nature of the way that we live today. But nevertheless, it is an area in halacha, and it's good to know how it works and what people are talking about.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So in New York, not a problem, Brooklyn, but in Deal, what's the end of the city? Long Branch keeps it adds on. It's not.
Yeah, it's the same. In Deal, it doesn't. One city to the next city to the next city. It's hard to get to.
They're all connected.
To find the end of the city, although ahead west, now you start to. It's a walk. It's far. I'll tell you where this comes into play. Which people, unfortunately, a lot of people are not careful about. I know a lot of people do bike riding, right? And you could bike ride and you can get to the outside of the Tehum, and obviously there's other issues, because can you ride the bike outside of an Eruv altogether, the other kind of Eruv. But let's say you say yes to that, right? Let's say that's not an issue. But, once you're getting to the farmland, and things like that, that's already outside the Tehum. So definitely in Jersey, you can get to this. In New York, it's, where we, certainly upstate New York, you could get to it. But New York City, that city is pretty big, and it just keeps going, The only question that some people I've heard talk about is crossing the bridge, right? In other words, if I go on the Brooklyn Bridge, like I walk over the bridge, am I now exceeding the Tehum, right? Because as the water, that water is now outside the Tehum and so on. And how far is that? Do I have to set a box of bread on the Brooklyn Bridge if I want to cross it? It's a good question. I don't know the length of the Brooklyn Bridge. I could Google it, but it's an interesting question. So let me look and see it. How long is the Brooklyn Bridge? So how about that? The Brooklyn Bridge is 5,989 feet long, right? So actually, the Brooklyn Bridge is a great case, right? If someone wants to walk, from Brooklyn to Manhattan, right? And he wants to cross the Brooklyn Bridge, right? That's a way to do it, right? And I actually know a lot of people who do this often. I know a lot of guys that you probably know a lot of guys also. They run from the city to Brooklyn, or from Brooklyn to the city as exercise. They go from their offices home or from the office. I know a number of guys that do it, and they cross the Brooklyn Bridge usually. So if you wanted to do it on Shabbat, probably you would need to set aside, I don't know how you get it to stay there, but a box somewhere on the Brooklyn Bridge, which we're going to talk about how you would do that. So there is our practical example of Tehum Shabbat, to get from Brooklyn to Manhattan, which, by the way, there's reasons to do that. You could have a friend that's having a Sebit. It's not that far. It's doable, especially if you're taking a bike, right? It's really not a long ride to get there. So if someone's making a Sebit in the Safra Shul, or, let's say someone's in the hospital and you want to go visit them, there's lots of reasons that could be, and that could apply. So I guess that's where that would come into play. So he says like this, how do you make an Eruv? So he says, so by the way, okay, we'll get to that. Okay. So he says, one of the things about the Eruv is that you have to be there for Ben Hashemashot, right? What does Ben Hashemashot mean? From sunset until it gets dark. So about a half hour at the start of Shabbat, you need to be there, right? That's like part of what has to happen. So you want to go there at Ben Hashemashot you consider that your place, then you could go home, go eat at home, go to sleep and whatever, and then come back, right? Then the next day you could do your walk or whatever it is. So now he says, so how do you do this? He says, you take bread to cover you for 2 meals, right? So how much is enough bread to cover you for 2 meals? The volume of 6 eggs. He says, or something that you'd put on the bread, like fish or meat or something like that, enough for 2 meals. Says then you make a beracha, asher kedishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mitzvat eruv, the beracha that you make on this, and then you say, with this eruv, it should be permitted for me to walk from one place, right, whatever place that I'm starting, from Brooklyn, 2,000 amah in any direction, right? I could go, from this eruv allows you. It says, and if I'm making the eruv, not just me, making it for other people, he should say, you name the eruv for who it's for the Gindi family, for the community, for whoever you're making it for, you say that, and then you could go home, right? Wherever he puts that, he has now 2,000 amot. It's as if he lives there. Now, you have to put food for all people that will use it, right? So if it's for me, I need to put enough bread for me for 2 days. If it's for the Ashkenazi family, right? So then I have to say, well, how many people in the Ashkenazi family? Oh, so I have to put more bread, right? You have to really make an eruv. Normally we do the eruv chatzerot. 1 meal is sufficient for everybody. You put a couple of matzahs, it's fine, right? But for the eruv techumin, you actually have to put a meal for each person that would potentially use it, and they have in mind. So that's something else. You can have somebody else set up an eruv for you, right? So let's say I'm busy on Friday. I'm working hard. I'm preparing my speeches, running my business, doing whatever I'm doing. And I say, okay, Teddy, go and set up the eruv for me. He can do that. And he can say, I'm setting up the eruv so my dad could, can go be there. So you can hire, or, just ask somebody to do it for you. That's fine. But when he makes and that person makes the beracha, but when I am the one who says, with the bread that he set aside there, that allows me to travel. Okay, I said before that if you send someone, you need to have bread for each of them. And the shaliach has to be appointed for everyone. You can't use the shaliach as like a real job. So you can't send a kid to do it. When I mean a kid, I mean not bar mitzvah. However, you can send a kid just to place the food there, and then you make the beracha, and you say, this is my eruv. So if you can see the kid going, right? Meaning if you can see, I could see 2,000 amah, and you could actually see 2,000 amah. I see the kid's going there. Okay, he's going, he's putting, I'm making the beracha. That's fine. That'll work also. A kid who is less than 6 years old doesn't need an eruv altogether, right? Meaning, let's say I'm walking and I'm taking my 5-year-old daughter, right? So if I'm going to walk and I'm going to take my 5-year-old daughter, I only have to leave enough bread for me. I don't have to leave enough bread for me. If I take my 8-year-old son, right, I have to leave enough bread for me and my 8-year-old son in order that he can walk. Okay, you can only make the eruv for the purpose of a positive purpose, some kind of mitzvah. However, we're pretty lenient about what does it mean for a mitzvah. Certainly to visit a sick person, that's a huge mitzvah. To go to the Bet Knesset, huge mitzvah. To teach a class or to learn a class, all mitzvah, obvious. But even if I were to say, Central Park is beautiful on Shabbat, I really enjoy walking there. And I would enjoy my Shabbat that much better if I got to walk in Central Park. That's fine too, right? So it's pretty lenient in terms of what's included. I guess the things that would be not included is you can't walk there for things that you can't do, right? Like whatever, I don't know, you can come up with things that you can't do, right? So so that's something that's significant. The eruv has to be set up. The box has to be there. The food has to be there before sun sets, right? Like you have to have taken care of the eruv before the sun sets. You don't want to wait till sunset. It says, but if you didn't set it up until after sunset, but before it got completely dark, it's okay. It's not the ideal way to do it, but it would be considered an eruv, and you would be able to rely upon it. Okay. Now, what's interesting is not only am I bound by the eruv, not only am I bound by Tehum Shabbat, so are my animals and so are my objects, my possessions. So I have to be careful to keep me and my things within my boundaries. So if I have a dog, right, I have to make sure my dog doesn't leave the boundary. If I have a cow, I have to make sure the cow doesn't leave the boundary. So that's not so practical for us either, but okay. Let's say someone has to leave the Tehum for a medical emergency or a security emergency or something like that. That's no problem. We can violate Shabbat for more than that. So certainly on this type of thing, that's not a problem. So someone who has to go to the hospital, that's not an issue. If there's some kind of security defense issue that's affecting the people or something like that. So that would be okay. And actually, the next topic that we're going to get to starting tomorrow is what are the laws of dealing with an ill person, someone who's sick. So we're going to get to that tomorrow. Okay. When would this eruv apply? Obviously, as we've been talking about Shabbat, this all applies on Shabbat. It also applies for Yom Kippur, right? And Yom Kippur, both eruv apply, right? The eruv for carrying, because on Yom Kippur you're not allowed to carry, and also the eruv, which we're talking about today, eruv techumin, the traveling a couple of amot. On Yom Tov, also, it's forbidden to travel outside the Tehum, and you could set up the Tehum. So you can't set up the Tehum on Yom Tov. You could set it up so that you can go from town to town on Yom Tov. So that's also part of it. And that is basically the laws of Tehum Shabbat. At least that's what we're going to do here. We'll stop here for today. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
Actually, Rabbi, I have an island. Is that a natural eruv if it's completely surrounded by water?
So an island is not necessarily an eruv, not in and of itself. Because usually, the way that it's not like walls. It needs to be, kind of walled in some way. So the truth is, when we talk about Brooklyn, we didn't really talk about the eruv that we have in Brooklyn the other day. I'll say a little bit about it. In Brooklyn, we have a very different kind of eruv than most other places. Most cities, we talked about this the other day. Ezra, I'm just going to mute you for a sec. There's a little background noise. In Brooklyn, there's, in most other places, when we use an eruv, we set poles and strings, all the way around, because most of the cities that we live in don't have walls all the way around them. Jerusalem, the old city does, but most other places don't have that today. It's just not the way cities are constructed for the most part. Happens to be Brooklyn, most people are not aware, it does have a wall all the way around it. And there's a few of them actually, depending on where you are. One of the walls is if you go to like Caesar's Bay, a seawall and a railing, which is a pretty substantial wall that goes for miles. And that's something that's usable as a wall. Also on the Belt Parkway, there are fences all the way around to prevent people from getting onto the Belt Parkway. So some of those are usable as well. So actually, when they constructed the Brooklyn eruv, the community Brooklyn eruv, they counted some of those walls. It ends up being that the majority of the eruv in Brooklyn is using walls and not using poles and strings. So actually, the Brooklyn eruv is what you might call one of the most solid eruv, and I don't mean that just as a wall. Meaning halachically, it's I don't want to say there's no leniency, because the whole eruv concept is a little bit of a leniency, but it's much less of a leniency than the eruv that exists in Deal or in Jerusalem or in Manhattan, where all of those eruvim, they use the what we'll call the poles and the strings. The Brooklyn Eruv uses some poles and strings, no question, but most of it is not. Most of it is actual physical walls, it's pretty, I won't say unique, but basically unique in that way. So that's something that's interesting about the Brooklyn Eruv. I forgot the question, but you asked me about the island. So Brooklyn, which is Long Island, right? The island itself doesn't make it Eruv, but it's interesting the way that the Brooklyn Island kind of is set up today. A lot of it is man-made in terms of the way that it's done, but there's this huge wall that runs for miles and miles, and there's these other fences that are set up, and so on. And even, one of the things that's true about Brooklyn, that another thing that people can use sometimes, I don't think they really did this, is if you go down like a Coney Island Avenue or a Nostrand Avenue, where basically the buildings are a wall all the way down the street. Each building is connected to the next. You get to the corner and there's some space, but that space is very small relative to the buildings. So in theory, you could use those buildings as walls also. I don't think that's what they do for the Brooklyn Eruv, but it's something that in theory, when you have a place where lots of buildings are close to one another, it's something that you could use as an Eruv. Anyway,
okay.
Good.
Okay,
let's stop today and
have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody.
Great day.
As well.